When Hironobu Sakaguchi pitched the idea for what would end up becoming Final Fantasy, he did so as a disillusioned creator looking to find meaning in his work. It ended up being a fated decision. Having his petitions to make an RPG denied numerous times before, along with his team, Sakaguchi poured his heart and soul into Final Fantasy, and upon its release, it became a landmark title for Square. Now, some 30 years later, according to recent figures, across the various main series and spin-off titles, there have been more than 149 million Final Fantasy games shipped worldwide. This places Final Fantasy alongside the likes of Minecraft, Tetris, The Legend of Zelda, and Need for Speed as one of only 16 franchises that have sold more than 100 million copies. What makes this feat even more impressive is that this number is increasing at a rapid rate despite the franchise being quite old. It's perhaps not as venerable as the likes of Pong and Space Invaders, but Final Fantasy and also Zelda are over 30 years old, and despite this, they have both been able to remain relevant on a global scale. Without question, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of the most anticipated games right now, and in terms of its legacy, its reveal back at E3 2015 sits as the 5th most viewed video of all time on the PlayStation YouTube channel. Likewise, Breath of the Wild went on to break sales records for a Nintendo launch game in multiple regions after being the most talked about game at E3 2016 by a landslide. What's perhaps most interesting about these 16 franchises though is how inherently unique they are, and not just because their base genres are all different. Each of them has navigated the minefield of growth, expansion, and attempting to stay relevant in a unique way thanks to different strategies that have been adopted and changed over time. Some have opted for much less frequency but bigger and better experiences, while others chose to take that same route while supplementing with additional experiences to try and keep fans engaged. It's kept these 16 franchises ahead of the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog, Resident Evil, The Elder Scrolls, and even Halo in terms of total sales, and given how successful these franchises have been, there's clearly no right or wrong way to navigate this. But in the case of Final Fantasy, it's perhaps more interesting than most due to how diverse, expansive, and sometimes even how divisive the content has become. Prior to the release of Final Fantasy, Square had been seeing modest growth. They had released numerous games, but none would have been considered a breakaway success. When they decided to shift their focus towards the Famicom, their fortunes did improve, but they were nowhere near releasing the likes of Bomberman, Gradius, or Lode Runner, each of which was also from a third-party developer and had managed to sell around 1 million copies. However, thanks to the combination of Sakaguchi and Nasir Gabili, a reputable programmer from North America, they were making good progress. Despite Gabili not even speaking Japanese, the pair worked with Kazuko Shibuya to create 3D World Runner and Rad Racer, and they managed to sell around 500,000 copies. But despite being very innovative for their use of technology, both games were accused of being quite derivative, 3D World Runner of Space Harrier and Rad Racer of Outrun. It's what led Sakaguchi to consider quitting the industry, but his decision to stay on for one final project ended up being a game changer for Square. Upon its release in Japan, Final Fantasy sold 520,000 copies at a retail price of 5,900 yen. Back then, this made around 3.6 billion yen, or around $24 million if we're looking at the comparable value of the dollar during the same time period. For a company like Square, it cannot be understated just how huge this was, and perhaps the easiest way to demonstrate this is by looking at the comparative performance of Rad Racer, a game that was up there as one of the most successful in the company's history. Rad Racer sold around 200,000 copies following launches in Japan, North America, and Europe. Now, we don't have the exact regional breakdown of where these sales came from, but for the sake of this example, let's just say that half of those sales came from Japan and the other half came from North America and Europe. In Japan, Rad Racer only retailed for 4,500 yen. It would have therefore made around 450 million yen in terms of domestic revenue. In North America, NES games were typically retailing for around $50, and in Europe, the fee was an equivalent. This worked out at around 7,000 yen at the time, which sounds great, but Square didn't publish the game outside of Japan, so it's kind of a moot point as their share of any international revenue would have been significantly diminished. It meant that for all its success, Rad Racer was dwarfed in an instant, but Sakaguchi and his boss, Masafumi Miyamoto, couldn't have been any happier. The success of Final Fantasy showed how dynamic the industry was back then. 3D World Runner, its sequel, Rad Racer, and Final Fantasy were all developed by Sakaguchi, Kabili, and Shibuya within a 9-month period. And by the end of that period, the direction of Square as a whole had been set in stone. Truth be told, any one of those games, or indeed any of the other games Square developed that Sakaguchi had no hand in, could have easily been the one that shattered the glass ceiling. But since Final Fantasy ended up being that game, it was decided that the focus should be placed around building out the brand, and the rest of the company should assist where it made sense to do so in maximizing the opportunity that had presented itself. Over the next 3 years, this new internal focus was pretty clear to see, and it was in stark contrast to the 3 years before. Square had always dabbled around, attempting desperately to find the right recipe for success. It saw them develop their own games, co-develop others, and publish games that had been developed by third parties. In their first year, Square only released one game, but by 1987, this scattergun approach saw Square release 14 games in a single year, with 8 being developed and published in-house. The dramatic shift brought about by Final Fantasy's success was that between 1988 and 1990, Square only released 7 titles, and only 4 of them were first party. To make the change in approach even more blatant, the 3 third-party games that were released did so right after Final Fantasy. It highlighted that Square no longer believed they needed support from others to fuel their growth, and the reduction in releases showed that Square wanted to invest more time in creating quality experiences, no doubt realizing that many more eyes would now be upon them. They had created the concept. They had backed Sakaguchi by pumping that concept out to double their intended audience, and now that audience wanted proof that they could do it again. Fans had to wait almost a year for that proof, and Square no doubt hoped their renewed focus would deliver improved results, but there was trepidation as doing so still represented a risk. They mitigated some of this risk by developing Hanjoku Hero, and this was released 2 weeks before Final Fantasy II, but in reality, Square had kind of put all their eggs in one basket, and if we're continuing on with that metaphor, then the basket carrying the eggs was perhaps not made from the safest material. As there had never been any plans for a sequel, Sakaguchi decided not to try and fudge a story continuation. It would see Final Fantasy II instead set in a new world, with a new cast of characters and a brand new story that would have no relation to what came before. On top of that, it was also decided that Final Fantasy II would have brand new gameplay, so it really wasn't what most would have expected from a sequel. Despite those changes, Final Fantasy II generated 67% more revenue than its predecessor when it launched, and with Final Fantasy III posting comparatively similar results when it released in 1990, if we're continuing on with the metaphor even further, it was pretty clear that not only had the dubious basket kept all the eggs safe, but that Sakaguchi was now a goose that could lay golden eggs. Square's decision to cut down on the production of other games and focus on Final Fantasy had also been validated in the best possible way, and its success brought about a lot of stability that could be used as a basis for some risk-controlled expansion. It saw the original Final Fantasy localized and released in North America. Makai Toshi Saga was also released in North America after being rebranded as a Final Fantasy game, despite it not even being one. Both of these decisions paid off, and these 2 releases, in addition to Final Fantasy III, helped the franchise generate 17.7 billion yen in a single year, the equivalent value of over $100 million. In the immediate aftermath, Square's software lineup became much more focused around what they knew they could sell. Final Fantasy IV was released and then re-released later in the same year, and Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden appeared as the first proper Final Fantasy spin-off. The only other game released that year was a sequel in the now established Saga franchise, but despite the increased frequency, none of these releases continued to see the same exponential returns. This would have no doubt concerned Square, but thanks to the release of Final Fantasy V, any fears were allayed. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a game purpose-built to take advantage of an increased interest within North American audiences, also performed much better than Final Fantasy IV had done when it was released in that region. And when Final Fantasy VI released with a huge retail price and still sold bucket loads, smiles returned to the faces of executives at Square as the 3 games had generated a combined revenue of 61 billion yen, more than every prior Final Fantasy release combined by a long way. The first iteration of Final Fantasy's success saw Square create Saga, Mana, and Mystic Quest. each of which ended up being associated with Final Fantasy in some shape or form. But now that Final Fantasy V and VI had continued the upward trajectory, Square gained supreme confidence in the franchise as their main product. It saw them expand with less care about risk, and this afforded new opportunities for developers who had been tied to those three aforementioned franchises for some time. When Live Alive released on the 2nd of September 1994, it represented the first original release from Square for over 4 years, and it opened the floodgates, as Square released a suite of new RPGs. Front Mission, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Evermore, Bahamut Lagoon, Super Mario RPG, Treasures of the Rundra, and Treasure Hunter G all launched in the space of just 1.5 years. It harkened back to the days of old Square, before Final Fantasy even existed, where they did nothing but explore and experiment. Many of these games did well for the company too, but their performance was eclipsed by the release of the next main series Final Fantasy game, which arrived as Square's first ever title on the PlayStation. Up until that point, the success of Final Fantasy had always been driven by Japanese sales, but the release of Final Fantasy VII was a watershed moment in that regard. In reality, Final Fantasy VII was the first main series game to underperform in Japan compared to its predecessor. Despite selling over 1.3 million copies more than Final Fantasy VI, it generated less revenue as its retail price was almost half. But thanks to performance in North America and Europe, Final Fantasy VII became the first game in the franchise to generate over $500 million. Around this time, Square had also laid down plans to help build up the franchise in more sustainable ways. This had seen them start to re-release older games with updates on new platforms, take advantage of long localization times with international versions, use their popular characters to promote other properties, and release spin-offs that catered to different audiences. Final Fantasy Tactics was one of the best in this regard, and it generated 16 billion yen upon its release, more than any of the first 4 numbered titles, and over 3 times what they had seen from the release of Mystic Quest. But during this time, Square also started releasing lesser quality cash grabs around their beloved Chocobo mascot, even launching a Pocket Station spin-off called Chocobo's World. This was a supporting title for Final Fantasy VIII, which launched 2 years after Final Fantasy VII, and when it did, it gained the unfortunate landmark of being the first main series game to generate less revenue than the one before. It did still generate 52 billion yen though, so it wasn't exactly a failure. Same could also be said about Final Fantasy IX, which generated only 36 billion yen, a figure much less than the 2 previous games, but one that still ranked it as the 3rd highest grossing game in the history of the franchise. Had this trend happened 5 to 10 years earlier, Square would have no doubt been quite worried, but they had started to expand to the point that although Final Fantasy was still very important to them, it wasn't their only source of revenue anymore. For example, looking at their Japanese revenue on the PlayStation, we can see that less than half of it came from numbered Final Fantasy games. By comparison, almost 3/4 came from that same source between the releases of Final Fantasy I and VI. Similar to the previous lull, the next big Final Fantasy then allayed any lingering fears, as Final Fantasy X generated more revenue than any other game in the company's history, approximately 70 billion yen. This was almost 20% higher than Final Fantasy VII, and it was again thanks to a significant contribution from revenue generated outside of Japan. Keen to build upon Final Fantasy X's success, Square Enix decided that they were again ready for expansion, and this time around it was based on Yuichi Wada's polymorphic content ethos. It saw them again shy away from creating new properties, and the exploitation of existing franchises was amplified to new levels. Final Fantasy X-2 released soon after as the first ever game-based sequel in the franchise, as Square wanted to exploit demand within the fanbase. And based on performance, their decision was justified. X-2 generated 38 billion yen worldwide, more than every other Final Fantasy game released in history outside of 7, 8, and 10, and it had done so with production budgets cut down significantly. Square were no doubt thrilled, and when Final Fantasy XI started to deliver the rewards they'd imagined, they pushed full steam ahead with their expansion plans. Earlier Final Fantasy games began to be remade, more sequels were rolled out, and spin-offs became dime a dozen. The hope was that this would help to inflate the revenue Final Fantasy was bringing in, but the harsh reality was that creators were being spread too thin, and all this approach did was create confusion. Someone like Tetsuya Nomura went from working on 16 games in his first 10 years at the company to working on 29 in his next 10, or 3 per year. And he wasn't alone in this regard. Motomo Toriyama directed Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings and wrote the scenario for Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a King, all while he was also directing Final Fantasy XIII, and senior figures like Hajime Tabata and Yoshiki Nara were constantly being torn between projects. It led to disasters like Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Agito 13, where creators could not find the time to focus on their projects and often worked on them in their spare time just to try and get things done. This anecdote sums this time period up better than I ever could. Final Fantasy Type 0 was announced in 2006. At the time, only Tabata, Naora and Nomura were on the staff. Work was being done on Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, so it was only in 2008 that actual development began. Even then, the development team also had to work on the third birthday, so Type 0's development was kept at a minimum for about a year. Naora said this was the longest he'd ever worked on a single game. At the time of the game's announcement, they had nothing but a single main visual ready. It perhaps comes as no surprise then that none of these games were ever able to find their feet in the way that the main series games could. Even though games like Crisis Core and Dissidia did well in terms of sales figures, they struggled to match even the performance of Final Fantasy Tactics due to the lower price point, and none of them ever generated more revenue than Final Fantasy IV, with most being more comparable to Final Fantasy II, generating between 5 and 10 billion yen each. Final Fantasy XII and XIII did post strong returns though, but by this point, performance in Japan was starting to decline. Despite everything Final Fantasy X had achieved, it did not generate more revenue in Japan than Final Fantasy VI, VII or VIII, and Final Fantasy IX didn't even surpass the performance of Final Fantasy V in this region. There was still no doubt plenty of growth potential for the brand, but there was a continued reliance on Western gamers to deliver this growth, and this trend only became more pronounced with every release that followed. By the time Final Fantasy XV was released, only around 15% of the revenue was coming from Japan, making it the third worst performing main series game in that region. And the scary thing is that had Final Fantasy XV delivered similar results to 7, 8 or 9 in Japan, it would have become the highest revenue generating game in the history of the franchise, outside of the MMOs of course. You could point to the declining Japanese market as to why this was happening, but Dragon Quest has never been impacted in the same way. For this franchise, revenue from Japan has always remained steady and is only now starting to be supplemented by additional revenue streams from the West. Its creators, who despite now working within the same company, have been able to better adapt and stay with the changing needs of the Japanese audience, not being seduced by chasing dreams of riches abroad. At this point, Square Enix are perhaps too far down a certain path with Final Fantasy to be able to bring it back to the levels they once had in their home region, but doing so must be seen as either a primary or at least secondary priority for them, as the revenue is much more valuable due to reduced expenses, and it will be certainly interesting to see how well the Final Fantasy VII Remake performs upon its release in Japan. It should also be noted that Japanese revenue has been coming in from other sources, notably the mobile experiences. These offerings built out at a time when Square Enix were toiling around with the main numbered series. Each Final Fantasy XIII sequel posted diminishing returns, to the point where Lightning Returns barely made more money than Final Fantasy II and probably cost a hell of a lot more money to make. Record Keeper, Brave Exvius and Mobius formed a solid backbone, and even though 2 of those games came out thanks to collaborations with third parties, the revenue has still been strong. Final Fantasy XIV and XV also ended up being 2 bright spots despite the trials and tribulations they both went through. Final Fantasy XIV, thanks to its continued growth, is likely to surpass Final Fantasy XI at some point as the most profitable game in the company's history, and Final Fantasy XV generated approximately as much revenue as Final Fantasy VII with its base release, and no doubt supplemented this further thanks to its various DLC expansions. Due to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the franchise remains relevant, and when that particular game launches, it will no doubt surpass Final Fantasy X as the highest revenue generating game in the history of the franchise, but it's about what happens next. Right now, we have sparse, fresh experiences that are being propped up by nostalgic mobile games and HD remasters, and an MMO that's living its best life. The Final Fantasy VII Remake will perform well, but based on what's happened in the past, we know that the next part will more than likely see diminishing returns, so it means attentions will need to focus on Final Fantasy XVI as the next experience that can try to drive the franchise even further. That is, unless Square Enix can come out with a spin-off that actually manages to capture consumer interest and perform in a way that no previous spin-off ever has. There's plenty of room for optimism though. as even though the main series entries don't release anywhere near at the same level of frequency as they once did, and recent spin-offs have failed to hit the mark, the franchise is continuing to generate revenue at consistently high levels on a yearly basis, and as long as that carries on, Square Enix will continue to keep thinking about new and exciting ways to bring Final Fantasy to the world. Either way, I hope you guys have enjoyed this more analytical look at how the franchise is built out over time. I ended up having to take a few liberties with the data, as for example, it doesn't account for discounts in price, but I think it's pretty interesting nonetheless, and it's really fascinating to see how cyclical the Final Fantasy franchise has been. If you enjoyed it, then please do hit that like button and let me know what you thought in the comments. Just as a small update about how we're doing, as many of you know, we had a bit of a nightmare these past few weeks, but we're hopefully back in the swing of things now. We've got a new laptop, our health is on the mend, hopefully, and we just wanted to say thanks for bearing with us during this time. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.